Assalamu alaikum. Let's cook. Today, I have to highlight the black women who helped with the cure to tuberculosis. We have to talk about these women. This is a special group of black women in our history, American history, our black history. They were known as the Black Angels. This was a group of black women, nurses, who helped defeat the tuberculosis epidemic in America, okay? Now, people at one point, tuberculosis was a serious deal. In the United States around the 1900s, this disease killed 153,000 people a year. It was serious. It was so common that tuberculosis was called consumption because people who had this disease, who suffered from it, they slowly wasted away. You know, they would just slowly wither away. It attacked the lungs. They would be coughing first, coughing up blood, fevers, night sweats, weakness, severe weight loss, and then death. Tuberculosis was serious. Due to the hard work, discipline, and bravery of these black nurses who we call the Black Angels, they have a cure. Now, these women did not make or create the cure to tuberculosis. They ran the daily operations in this hospital so that these people actually had some leeway or some breathing room to do their work. Had it not been for what these nurses did in the hospital, these scientists and doctors, they would not have been able to create this cure, okay? So people, this was the deadliest disease in America at the time. And New York City had a serious problem with tuberculosis. One of the city's major institutions for treating tuberculosis was Seaview Hospital on Staten Island. Now, this was a huge tuberculosis hospital. It opened in the year 1913 and it treated thousands of patients. Now, by the late 1920s, this Seaview Hospital had a serious problem. They needed nurses. Working with tuberculosis was very dangerous. So at this time, there's no cure. These nurses, they're constantly exposed to these infected patients. Some nurses even contracted the disease. And in the year 1929, Seaview Hospital, the tuberculosis hospital, was facing a serious nurse shortage. Now, at the same time, there were thousands of trained black nurses in America who faced another problem. They had the education, they had the qualifications, they could work as professional nurses anywhere, but due to racial segregation, Satanism, American white supremacy, they were limited in what they could do. Many hospitals in the South refused to give these black nurses a job, or they would just restrict them to caring for black patients. Now in the North, hospitals in New York, like this one that treated tuberculosis, Seaview, they were having staffing issues. So in 1929, Seaview Hospital, they had a major exodus of white nursing staff. These nurses were leaving the hospital one after the other for several reasons. First, they had to work long shifts, 12 hours, exhausting working conditions. They had to commute to Staten Island, which was rough for some of them. Then, these women had fear of contracting this disease, tuberculosis. Because 1929, there's no effective antibiotic cure for this disease, okay? And these nurses, these white women in the hospital in New York at the tuberculosis hospital, they were shook, they were scared. They were saying, let's get out of here before we catch this. And that's what they did. So New York City said, okay, we got to do something about this. What they did was they started to recruit black nurses from the South to work at Seaview Hospital. So this was like an opportunity for these black nurses, okay? They had to walk into the lion's den and face this tremendous risk of catching tuberculosis, but they could leave the Jim Crow South, they can get a stable government salary, and they could advance professionally. But they got to work with this deadly disease. This is America's deadliest infectious disease at the time, so that's the trade-off. So hundreds of black nurses answered the call, and then 300 nurses were hired by this hospital, okay? They hired 300 black nurses, and these black women, became known as the Black Angels. They eventually made up the majority of Seaview Hospital's nursing staff. It was like all black nursing staff almost. Called these women Black Angels because the work that they did, they were like angels to these sick patients. Had it not been for these black nurses, they wouldn't have been able to move on with the cure to this disease. Some of these nurses, some of the names of these early nurses: Edna Sutton, she was from Savannah, Georgia; Missouri Meadows Walker from North Carolina; Marjorie Tucker Reed from Georgia, and all the rest of them. Salute to you. You know, there were many more. There were just some names of some women who were actually recognized, who people actually knew. These women were in the mainstream. Eventually, they were recognized for what they did. Now, let's talk about when these women got to New York. So they're coming from the South. They arrive in New York. They're expecting this greater opportunity. But you got white people in New York too. It's not the South, but you have white people. They're crackers in New York. The intensity of the cracker may not be as stale, but it's there. Racial discrimination, okay? When they got to New York, they have to work at this hospital. They have to look for housing, places to go, where they're going to live at. So they're dealing with that on an everyday basis. You know, the hospital itself, there's still white people around. You could imagine some of these white people at the hospital with tuberculosis were probably calling them the N-word and all kind of stuff, you know? So it wasn't so easy for them just because they left the South. They still had to deal with all kinds of hardships in the North. So now these black nurses are at work. They're doing their 1-2. They're still dealing with stubborn white people. They're getting the job done. They become pretty much the whole staff at Seaview. The work is very difficult. Remember, all the white ladies left, all the white nurses, they ran off, they couldn't do it. You know, tuberculosis patients, they could remain in the hospital for months, even years. No antibiotics. You know, there were very few options in what they could do. And the treatment for this disease, it consisted of rest, nutrition, fresh air. You know, doctors would do things like experiment to see if they could do things with these patients' lungs, like rest their lungs, collapse their lungs, to see if they could just get something going, because there was no reliable cure. You know what I mean? These black nurses, they were not administering any medicine. They were feeding the patients, bathing them, monitoring them, making sure they had everything they needed, managing their symptoms, just caring for these seriously ill and dying people. And every interaction with these people potentially exposed them to tuberculosis themselves. So just think, we got about 300 black nurses at this hospital, Seaview, caring for over 2,000 patients. And many of these nurses did develop tuberculosis infections also, but a lot of them, more of them got a latent and inactive form of tuberculosis. You get what I'm saying? Meaning they were infected with the bacteria, but they didn't develop the active tuberculosis disease. Some of them did pass away though. Some of these black nurses did get tuberculosis. They developed the active form of tuberculosis and passed away, but not many, very, very few. One reason the Black Angels did so well with not getting tuberculosis is because they had very strict infection control procedures. These black women at Seaview, these Black Angels, you know, they really took this stuff serious, this cleanliness serious. Cloth masks, gowns, changing protective clothing between seeing different patients, washing up carefully, changing clothes before they left the hospital, all that. You know, black people in cleanliness. You know what I'm saying? It's the culture. This is why so few of these Black Angels contracted tuberculosis. Now, this continued through the 1930s, the 1940s. Then the medicine began to change. In 1943, researchers at Rutgers University discovered something called streptomycin. Now, this was the first antibiotic shown to have significant activity against tuberculosis. But they also found that this streptomycin wasn't enough, and that tuberculosis could actually develop a resistance to it. So they needed better drugs. They had to come up with more, and then that led to them finding a drug called isoniazid. So in the early 1950s, researchers discovered that isoniazid was very effective against this bacteria that was responsible for tuberculosis. And Seaview Hospital in New York became one of the important locations where this drug was tested in tuberculosis patients, and it was successful. And the black nurses were there. They administered the medications, they monitored the patients, recorded their conditions, cared for them as the doctors and the researchers were able to do what they needed to do. Dramatic results from these drugs, people. These patients who were chronically sick, they started to improve, their fevers disappeared, appetites returned, they started to gain weight. People who were once expected to spend years inside these tuberculosis hospitals, they were able to go home. So isoniazid, combined with other antibiotics, helped transform these tuberculosis patients from a fatal disease in them to just a treatable infection to where they could actually go home and live their lives normal. This treatment became so successful that big hospitals like Seaview, these big tuberculosis hospitals, they were no longer needed in the same way, okay? Because the patient population started to decline. There weren't as many people that needed to stay in the hospital due to the fact that they had these tuberculosis drugs. So Seaview came to an end. There was no need for it anymore. Now this disease is controllable. But for decades, the black nurses, the black angels who kept Seaview functioning, they got very little recognition for what they did. These women who did this, they were not, you could say that they weren't recognized for what they did. There were a couple, places that they went in, platforms and people that called on them to talk about this, but they did not get the recognition, for being a major part in the cure to tuberculosis. If it was not for them, those doctors wouldn't have been able to do what they did. There would be no cure. This hospital would have just fell down. You know what I'm saying? So these black nurses provided something that was very necessary. Due to the hard work and the grit of these black women called the Black Angels, black nurses entered the New York City municipal hospital system. They helped challenge discriminatory practices. They expanded opportunities for other black nurses to come after them. So the black nurses in New York or probably other places, they owe and should pay homage to these black women right here, okay? Now these black women, the Black Angels, many of them spent decades working in healthcare. One of the last surviving Black Angels, her name was Virginia Allen. She was an important source for preserving their history. Now, Virginia Allen, she began working at Seaview as a young woman, and she lived long enough to see some of the contributions that they will later get for their important work. So people, what can we say? This is our history, an American story. We can go on and on with these stories. There's a problem. The white American racists, the Satanists, they can't figure it out. They can't solve it. Looks like they're going to be needing some help. They get so desperate that they decide to call black people, people who they hate, but also people who they low-key deep inside know are better than them at the job. They finally call black people. The black people want to be accepted as humans in America because this is where we have to live. And although we come to solve a problem that will ultimately help them and make them look good, and a lot of times save their lives and make them a whole lot of money, they still treat us bad, typical white people. And we overcome that. We get the job done. They're happy about it. Sometimes they recognize us for it 50, 100 years later and back to being an N-word. That's it, but we know what we did. We know what we do. That's why we have these stories. We can't really put too much into them because crackerism is stupid. I mean, American crackers are just stupid. You know what I mean? So we can't even wait for them to recognize us. But salute to these black women, the Black Angels. Link in the description to my masterpiece, The N-Word Is No Secret in the Service. Also link to the email list. Go ahead and holler at that so that you know what the content is, just in case it disappears. Easy.